Our next speaker is Christopher Carolan. Now, Christopher is a former member of the Pacific Stock Exchange. He's the author of the Spiral Calendar, which is an analysis of financial markets and human events. In our context, he is an author and for many years has been interested in textual contexts and literary scenes of Elizabethan and early Jacobean England. Now, happily, I was going to say I will warn you, but what I will say actually is Chris has got a very, very fancy presentation. So for all of you budding presenters, take a look at Chris's presentation. It's really something. Ladies and gentlemen, Chris Carolan.
I'm here to talk about William of Palerne and as a source for Shakespeare's, say, Crispin State speech. This is something I stumbled upon years ago just accidentally. Certainly wasn't looking for it, but today we're going to do three things. What's the background and the historical relevance of William of Palerne? Then look at the textual evidence that Shakespeare used this source line by line. And then I want to talk a little bit about the St. Crispin's Day speech in relationship to 14th century poetry and the alliterative long line form that was in use at that time. So, underway. William of Palerne, it's a romance written in French prose around 1200. But then it was translated into Middle English long line alliterative poetry probably between 1350 and 1360, and that's during the Hundred Years' War. It's a little while after the Battle of Crécy, and probably about 60 years before the Battle of Agincourt, which is the topic of the St. Crispin's Day speech. The poem, it's a long romance. If you know Shakespeare's Winter's Tale, you know about romance-type plots. They're crazy. I mean, in this one, the hero falls in love with an orphan girl who's been raised by the Pope. So such are romance plot lines. But it contains a 14-line exhortation where William the hero is motivating his troops to battle. And that's where we see the borrowings. And there's a couple of other parts too. Now, what's really interesting, we have no idea who the poet was who translated this, but we know who commissioned it. And that's the 6th Earl of Heffert. Humphrey de Bohun. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name right, but now the 6th Earl, his title passed to his nephew, the 7th Earl. 7th Earl is Henry V's maternal grandfather. So this piece of work, it's a family piece of literature. It was commissioned within Henry's family, and it's from that time period. So it's at the nexus of both the person and the events of the Crispin's Day speech. And for Shakespeare to use it shows historical relevance. He's apparently attempting to make something that is plausible. I mean, literally, Henry V may have read this and it may have inspired him when he actually did motivate his troops. So let's go and look now at line by line what's going on. Now, the top here is the last 3 lines of that 14-line exhortation plus the next line from the poet, compared with 6 lines from near the end of the St. Crispin's Day speech. And, there's all kinds of alliteration. We'll talk some more about that in a moment, but let's just get right in. Band of Brothers, that famous phrase that we all know and love. And that's how Henry addresses his troops. And William addresses his troops as friends and fellows. Now, editorially, this is the same concept. These are military leaders, but they're talking to their soldiers eye to eye. This isn't king versus subject or general versus soldier. It's friends, fellows, and brothers. Very same concept in both works. Next example, and I will just quickly put this into modern English. We don't have time to learn a new language today. And great worship shall you win while this world lasteth. And compare that to from this day to the ending of the world, but we in it shall be remembered. Exact same idea again, even down to showing us how long their memory will last in history. It's to a very specific point, and it's the same in both examples. Now here's the word construction. In Palerne, it's for him that do your deed today as doughty men shall, and Shakespeare for he today that. And so just simplify, you can compare these word constructions, and also the context, the deeds of the doughty men and the bloodshedding. It's the same topic there. And then finally, on this section, after William has finished the speech, the poet tells us that the men were comforted by the speech, and Shakespeare adds comfort into his Crispin's Day speech as well. This day shall gentle his condition. Now, another section of the Crispin's Day speech, and this phrase, manhood's cheap, and where does this come from? I think if you've seen Henry V, you may have seen an actor, if I may alliterate, perform a groin grab at that moment. Why put those two words together? What's the inspiration? Well, Palerne, the poet, refers to manhood, but in Middle English, they had a different word for manhood, and it was manship, as in worship, fellowship, etc., but it was spelled CH instead of SH. But if we look at the context in Palerne and translate that top line for you, it's within the context of talking about the people who didn't show up. Now, Palerne's a little different. There was a previous battle, and they didn't fight well, and William harangues them for being cowardly caitiffs. And in Shakespeare, he's calling out the people who are back home in bed. But same idea. It's the phrase is used within the context of the folks who didn't show up. So the textual evidence, it shows Shakespeare mining this historically appropriate document for editorial content. He's not borrowing the poet's words. The Palerne poet is not particularly a good one. And he's also, the focus of the two pieces is different. Palerne is discussing, mentions God 5 times, and Crispin only mentions it once. And in Crispin, the focus is really brought onto the soldiers and that worship that they shall win. And Shakespeare expends many lines on that, the naming of names, the showing of scars, etc. So there are differences, but it seems that Shakespeare really mined this document for these specific editorial points and gave it historical authenticity. So now let's talk about what is the Middle English alliterative longline, the form of poetry that Palerne is. And Shakespeare used other Middle English sources from this period and more well-known poems. Piers Plowman is a source, and Hamlet, and there are others. A long line, it's 2 half lines. It has a pause in the center, and each half line has 2 stressed syllables. Now, there are occasionally 3, but it's 2 stressed syllables each half line, and then those stressed syllables have the alliteration. There could be any number of unstressed syllables. There's no fixed line length. Now, alliterative poetry goes way back, and it's very conducive to Old English and Middle English, as most of the words were 2 syllables. When language brought in more Latin and French words into it, poetry moved on to rhyme endings and eventually blank verse, etc. But the interesting thing in this mid-14th century, and it's why it's called the alliterative revival, even though alliteration never died out, is because the alliteration is in excess. The poet goes over the top. So let's look at one line. This is a line we saw previously. Great worship ye shall win while this world lasts. Now we can see here are the 2 stressed syllables on each half of the line, and all 4 have alliteration. It's W's all the way across. Now let's look at the opening of Shakespeare's Crispin's Day speech, which is iambic pentameter, completely different beast. And he opens with a half line, not a full line. If we consider the first 2 statements as half lines, it looks like this. And here's the 14th century letter of long line form. Shakespeare opens a Crispin's Day speech with that. There's 4 stressed syllables, 3 of them are alliterate. It's somewhat textbook. Now, I would say right now, some lines in the Crispin's Day speech have no alliteration whatsoever. Let's look at another one. Familiar in his mouth is household words. And we can see the M's alliterate in the front and the H's on the back half. But wait, there's more. He's also got an H, he's got 3 H's alliterating here. But that's not all. He's got this mouth and house rhyme going on. I would encourage people to read the Crispin's Day speech, line by line, syllable by syllable, and to see how many repetitive sounds, repetitive words, echoes, mirroring of sounds you can find, because it's so very dense with this. Shakespeare takes a form that's already in excess, and then he's piling on more and more on top of it. I think the Crispin's Day speech is Shakespeare's bake-off showstopper. But let's show you how he hides some things here. We all know this, and we know what comes next. It's a palindrome. It's the same backwards and forwards, which means it contains its own echo. If you stretch it out, it sounds like an ambulance going down the street. Wee phew. There's so many ways that Shakespeare is mirroring sounds in this piece. So I think it's knowing that Palerne is a source here, it helps us see that the Crispin's Day speech, it's a 16th century poet paying homage to a 14th century art form in a sense. It's also now this idea that it is so dense in repetitive words and sounds. When we hear repetition, whether it's rhyme or whatever, it's pleasing to us because it's pattern, it's structure. The world's not random when we hear that second part of the rhyme, or when a piece of music returns to the home key, or a verse is repeated. Repetition in art is reassuring to us. And Shakespeare has loaded this speech up with so much reassurance. But reassurance is also the topic of the speech. Henry isn't motivating his troops to be more efficient killers on the battlefield. He's reassuring them that on the other side of this hell, the loop is going to get closed. There'll be pattern. We'll go back to where we came. And so the reassurance, and it's a subliminal, it builds in us as the speech goes along, and it matches so well with the words. And so I would say that the poetic style here is particularly well suited to the message. And Shakespeare, as an extravagant poet, is particularly well suited to the style. And of such confluences, masterpieces are made. I've got a couple of minutes. I want to say something about the topic of today's conference. And I think sources help us illuminate what genius is. And genius is a word tossed around with Shakespeare, and it's often described as a noun. The genius is a thing, a font from which any greatness can just be ejected, fully formed. But this conference helps us see that genius is the verb. It's what transforms sources and life experiences into artwork. And finally, I want to just mention the L word, and it's been mentioned a little bit here, library. And I think, Bob Dylan, we know that in his youth, he went and searched out every single piece of American folk music ever recorded. And when you see the breadth of Shakespeare's sources, it really seems like somebody who just went into a library and pulled every book off the shelf, or manuscript, or whatever. And as an Oxfordian, I like to think that, two of the fortuitous orphans, the orphan Michelangelo was made ward to a stonecutter, and the orphan Shakespeare was made ward to a very big library. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Chris. Very interesting, and as I say, very fancy presentation. Most impressed. Can I just ask you, how did you come to this? How did you come to this source, as you suggested is?
There's two pieces to the puzzle. About 24 years ago, my daughter was struggling with a school lesson of memorizing Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. And I pitched in to help, and we memorized together. And that's when I learned the Crispin Day speech. And being a little bit obsessive, I've run it through my head a few times every day for a few decades. It's pretty much imprinted. But then the other half was, I was searching for something completely different, and Palerne pops up in the search, and then I was curious, and it's insomnia, it's Google Books, you fall down a rabbit hole, and next thing you know, but I recognized it when I stumbled that, for him, that I scanned that and my brain just finished the sentence, sheds his blood with thee.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Chris. And are you exploring other related sources, or?
Well, no, I mean, Shakespeare sources aren't my particular interest. My interest in the authorship question is, and I'm a follower of a fellow named Rambler, and there's a lot of work going on behind the scenes, but it's investigating. I believe that the works of other playwrights, Chapman and Johnson, they tell the whole Shakespeare story in allegory and allusion. And that is my principal interest.
Okay, thanks. So we've got a question here from Michelle. Do we know what versions of Palerne were popular and available in the 1580s?
Yeah, good question. Right now, there is only one manuscript extant that is in Cambridge. It was never published in a book until the 19th century. But we do know it was known because we know that a translation into English prose was done in the 1570s. But we don't have a complete copy of that. There are only fragments of that translation. And also a translation into Irish was done. So the story was certainly around.
Okay, thanks for that. And do we know how much alliteration is in that speech compared with other speeches?
Well, I mean, there's a lot more alliteration in Shakespeare, and you could also trace it through the Euphuist movement. I mean, I think a lot of people's favorite alliterative line might be "Full fathom 5, thy father lies" from Tempest. So that's a much bigger topic, alliteration in Shakespeare, than I'm prepared to expound on.
Okay, and from Carol P here, which library or college in Cambridge?
I believe it's part of the Matthew Parker's collection, okay, which would be St. John's, I think. But I'm a Yank, so I'm not sure of the intricacies of the Brit universities.
Yeah, you are forgiven. Chris, here's an interesting question from Roger Stripmatter. I would like to hear Chris say more about the way sources can give us access to the Shakespearean imagination.
Well, that's a great question, but I think, just when you look at, in this example, for me, seeing it line by line and seeing how he recomposed Palerne's ideas, put it into his own words, it's genius at work, but hard to say more than that.
Okay, all right. Well, thanks very much for that, Chris. Thanks very much for a really interesting, very original presentation on the source material there. I think I've asked most of the questions. So if you, Chris, do feel free to pop into the chat then, or the Q&A if you want to respond. You'll see some very positive comments about your talk. So thank you very much.